reasons I really like the Tea Party movement is that people have gone back and studied the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, the Declaration of they've actually tried to understand what is it that made America so remarkable in the first place. So if our rights come directly from God to each one of you is personally sovereign. That's why you're a citizen, not a subject. You loan power to the government. The government does not loan power to you. That's right. And how deeply do you hold these rights? They are unalienable. What does that mean? It means no politician, no bureaucrat, no judge can come between you and your rights, because your rights came to you directly from God, and there is no being between you and God who can take away your rights. Now, this is central to understanding America. It's the opposite of Obama's class warfare, government centralism, bureaucratic socialism model. In his world, the government is sovereign, and we are merely subjects. In our world, we are citizens, and the government is our servant. Among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I want to make one brief point, which is that in the 18th century Enlightenment that this came out of, happiness meant wisdom and virtue. It did not mean hedonism and acquisition. The Founding Fathers believed that a wise and virtuous people could remain free forever, but that a foolish people would end up in a dictatorship. So there's a challenge here. One of the goals that I want to create for all of us is to understand, if we truly believe our rights come from our Creator, if we truly believe that every American is endowed with the right to pursue happiness, then how do we rethink every element of modern government so that the poorest people in the poorest neighborhood in New York City fully have a right to genuinely pursue happiness? And how do we communicate with them so that they come to realize that as Americans, they have every right, not a right to take from others, but a right to create, a right to work, a right to be responsible, a right to be engaged? And how do we get that message across in the poorest neighborhoods in a way that is effective and real? And how do we change institutions to encourage people to be involved in this? And I'm committed to thinking through and figuring out how we do this every way I can. I want to say two last things about this journey. The scale of change we need is much bigger than Barack Obama. He is in some ways a symptom. Bad judges, bad bureaucrats, bad laws, bad institutions, bad cultural values. I mean, the struggle is going to be enormous. And I want each of you to know that I will not ask you to be for me. Because if you're for me, you're going to vote and go home and say, I sure hope Newt fixes it. And no one person can achieve change in the scale we need to rebuild the country we love. And so I am going to ask you to be with me for the next 8 years. I'm asking you to be with me at 3 levels. First, stand side by side to remind the Congress and the governor and the state legislature and the city council and the mayor and the school board. This is the new direction we're going in, and we hope you will go in it with us, or we are going to fire you at the next election. Second, I want you to be with me for a very practical reason. We're going to make mistakes. You can't have change on this scale and do everything right. And when we make mistakes, I want to use social media so that you can let us know. You can email us, tweet us. We're going to build mechanisms so 305 million Americans become partners in creating a new, better, more dynamic, more prosperous America. As an example, I'm going to ask the Congress to put every conference committee on C-SPAN out in the open so every citizen can see what's going on. one should be with me for a reason that I think will really resonate in Staten Island. If we're going to shrink the Washington bureaucracy and implement the 10th Amendment, we have to grow citizens to fill the vacuum. If we're going to return power back home, we have to have citizens back home who accept the responsibility in the vote. And so this only works with a citizen movement. This doesn't work just with a normal campaign. Now, as you can see, I'm outlining very large, bold ideas. And that is why I will challenge President Obama to 7 3-hour Lincoln-Douglas-style debates with a ton fair. If he wants a teleprompter, he gets a teleprompter. Let me put it to you all now. Be honest. If you had to defend Obamacare, wouldn't you want a teleprompter? Now, people say to me he'll never agree. I don't think that's right. I think he will agree. And I'll tell you why. There are 3 reasons he's going to agree. The first is he announced for president in February of 2007 in Springfield, Illinois, quoting Lincoln. Now, how does he say, oh, he didn't mean any of that? The second is ego. This is a graduate of Columbia, Harvard Law School, editor of the Law Review, the best orator in the Democratic Party. How does he look in a mirror and say, he's afraid to debate some college teacher from West Georgia College? But the third reason is historic. As many of you know, I've studied history, and unlike the president, I've studied American history. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln has been out of office for 10 years. He only had the House seat for 2 years. He'd been a state legislator before that. For 10 years, he'd been in private practice. He's running against the best-known Democratic senator, a man people thought was going to be president of the United States in 1860. When he announces, Lincoln says, there are 105 days left. Why don't we debate every day? And Douglas says, I don't think so. So Lincoln adopts a policy. Wherever Douglas goes, Lincoln shows up the next day and answers it. And in about 3 weeks' time, Douglas figures out the newspaper coverage is consistently Lincoln's answer to Douglas. And so he sends him a letter and says, all right, I'll agree to the debates. There were 9 congressional districts back then. He says, you've already followed me in 2 of them. I'm not going back there, but I will do the other 7. And so that's how the debates occurred. They were very famous debates. I think they're the most important political dialogue since the Federalist Papers. They were widely covered across the whole country because they were fundamental. They're about the nature of freedom, the nature of the Constitution. Lincoln arranged to have them published the following year, and they were a major factor in his becoming president. So if I become the Republican nominee, and the president has not yet said yes, in my acceptance speech in Tampa, I will announce that from that date on, the White House will be my schedule. Wherever the president goes, I will go 4 hours later. But to do all that, I have to be your nominee. And to do that, I need to win delegates in New York. And to do that, I need your help. So I hope you'll decide to be with me. Twist and I both want you to feel like together, rooms like this across America are ready to replace Barack Obama, and we're ready to work with you. And now what I'd like to do, sorry, just toss it open to questions. Is that okay? Good. Yes. All right, microphone's coming to you this very second.
Coming out and seeing us in probably the only conservative area in New York City. And I have a three-pronged question for you, if you would please indulge me. Number one, I would like to know, will you bring the executive branch back into compliance with the limits of the Constitution?
Yes.
How will you do that?
By campaigning on returning the 10th Amendment to enforcement, and by campaigning on other bills. You can see if you go to newt.org, my first name.org, by getting the Congress to pass some things and by vetoing things that I regard as unconstitutional.
Thank you. And do you believe in term limits for congressmen and senators? And if so, what term limits, and how would you get them to agree with them?
I am very dubious about term limits because I've watched in California, and what they've done is they've guaranteed that the only people in town who don't know what they're doing are the legislators, because you don't have term limits for bureaucrats, you don't have term limits for lobbyists, and they've just ended up manipulating the legislature. I am in favor of campaign reform that will enable any American to give any amount of after-tax money, as long as it's reported every night on the internet. And I think you would rapidly defeat incumbents who are out of touch. I'd like to have a one-election term limit. If you're a bad member, let's beat you at the next election.
And thirdly, do you think that the Supreme Court justices should have term limits, and if so, how long?
No, I'm content with them having life appointments, but I did put a paper on reforming the judiciary at newt.org. If you see it, it's the boldest explanation of how to reform the judiciary since Lincoln's first inaugural in 1861. And it makes very clear that if I become president, we'll have a very strong effort to reform the judiciary. Go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Speaker. President Leonard from Smart Girl Politics. We haven't heard much from you on school reform since the road show with Reverend M. Mr. Speaker, what are trending? We are trending towards a nationalization of our curriculum within the public schools. The Common Core learning standards being an example of that. What are your thoughts on this initiative and the one-size-fits-all educational philosophy? What are your thoughts overall on school reform?
That's a very good question, educational reform. And let me say that we had a very interesting dialogue here in New York City that I think is on our website, or linked to on our website at newt.org. It was hosted by Paul Gigot and Joel Klein. Paul Gigot is the editor of the Wall Street Journal, and Joel Klein is the former chancellor. And we spent about 35 minutes talking about very large-scale change. Let me give you an example of where I'm coming from. We were doing a book signing in Naples, Florida last Friday, Saturday rather, and about 900 people showed up. And about halfway through it, this young lady, 8.5 years old, named Katrina, walks up, and she doesn't have a book, but she has 3 questions that she's written out. And so she asked me all 3. And one was, how many presidents had I known and which one did I like most? One was, had I ever had Godfather's Pizza? And one was, what kind of a pet would we have if we got to the White House? So it was very cute, and she was very serious, and she was a young lady. She wasn't there as a child. And turns out her mother's a reporter. She got up that morning and she said, go look up Newt on Google and learn these things. And then, she originally wrote out 12 questions, and Mom talked her down to 3 and said, I think we can get them. It was doubly fascinating because a couple people were here covering me were there that day. The press, which was frankly bored watching Calista and me sign books, suddenly had live bait. And here's an 8.5-year-old kid, perfect stuff. So all of a sudden we looked over, and here she is, surrounded by like 8 or 9 cameras. 8.5 years old. And she was just holding forth, chatting with them, totally comfortable. I mean, what was network news to her? Just another evening, another afternoon event. Now here's why I tell you that story. There is no possibility of a national curriculum being flexible enough to take advantage of somebody that smart and that mature and let them grow at the most rapid rate possible and learn as much as possible. And that's why I'm opposed to any national curriculum. I would frankly dramatically shrink the Department of Education, return federal back to
Get the back of the room.
Yeah,
Back in the room.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My name is Tony Ferrantino. I'm a Korean War veteran. When you become become our speaker, could we have your assurance that one of your top priorities will be the welfare of our veterans, past, present, and future? Thank you.
Before they start rioting, I want you to go back. We'll get 2 or 3 questions at the very back here in a second. Let me say that, first of all, my dad was also in the Korean War, and so thank you for serving our country. He served 27 years in the infantry, so you can imagine having grown up as an Army brat, where I stand on veterans and on military services. And I can assure you that keeping our commitment to the veterans and to their families will be a very, very high priority in the Gingrich administration.
My name is Daniel Joya, and I just want to let you know that I'm 100% behind you. And quite frankly, I believe you're the deliverer from liberals in Washington, D.C. My question to you is, we've seen under President Obama all the partisan bickering going on in Washington, closed-door dealings with unions, payoffs to senators in the form of pork and earmarks and bills, and even changing parliamentary procedure in order to get votes for health care. Now, how do you propose to get a consensus and to get Democratic support that is so necessary to move this country in the right direction, and also your agenda?
Well, that's a very, very important question. I'm glad you asked it. First of all, when I began running in the 1970s in Georgia, you had to get a lot of Democratic support. Because in the 1970s, my district was consistently more Democrat than Republican. So I had to sweep the Republicans, sweep the independents, and get a fair number of Democrats, or I had no hope of winning. When Reagan was elected, and Reagan was always very good. Cliss and I did a movie about Reagan a couple of years ago called Run to the Destiny. And there's a scene in there where Jerry Ford calls him up to speak in 1976, off the cuff. Reagan begins by saying, he's at the Republican National Convention. He begins by saying, my fellow Republicans, and those Democrats and independents around America who are listening and who share our values. And he always did that. Because Reagan wanted to be the American president, not just the Republican president. Now, when he got elected, and I played a small but pretty real role in hosting the first Capitol Steps event in history in 1980 with the Governor Reagan, and all the congressional and senatorial candidates. When he got elected, we didn't have a majority in the House. Tip O'Neill was Speaker. So we always had to get about 1/3 of the Democrats to vote with us. And we got very good at grassroots organizing because we had to have folks back home remind the swing Democrats why it was better to be with us than it was to be with the liberals. And all of Reagan's programs that were passed, the big tax cut, for example, you had to get 1/3 of the Democrats, you couldn't pass it. So I grew up, in politics, learning a lot about how you build bipartisan coalition. Clista was the chief clerk of the Agriculture Committee, which was very bipartisan. I was on Public Works, which was very bipartisan. And we came out of that kind of background. When we passed welfare reform, for example, we had a conversation. This is why public conversation is so important. 92% of the people in the country favored welfare reform. Now that meant that we split the Democrats evenly. 101 voted no and 101 voted yes. We had half the Democratic Party voting with us to reform welfare. So I would start and do 3 things. The first is, I would pick very large issues. And I would try to rally the American people. Reagan described it as that he would shine the light on the American people so they could turn up the heat on Congress. And that's why I ask you to be with me, because that's a key first part. Because remember, we also got to get Republican votes, and they aren't always going to like this stuff either. Second, you try to find things that make Democrats happy that don't involve selling out your principle. I've been trying for months now to get the House Republicans to pass the Webb-Warner bill. This is a bill that allows Virginia to develop oil and gas offshore. Webb and Warner are 2 Democratic senators. And I'm trying to get the House Republicans to understand if they would just pass the bill without amendment, send it to the Senate. How does Harry Reid stop 2 of his Democratic senators from bringing their bill up? If they bring it up, it's going to pass, because 8 or 9 pro-oil and gas Democrats are going to vote for it. More American energy is a 79% issue. You then send the bill to the president. He's got a pop. 4 out of 5 people like it. It creates American jobs. It creates American energy. and it increases royalties to the federal government. Now, I mean, it would be truly suicidal for the president to veto it. I'm not saying he would do it, but it would be really, at that point, the average American would think that he just was hopeless. But that's the kind of thing where you reach out. There's a last part. We couldn't have gotten done what we did without Clinton. Clinton had been governor for 12 years. He understood negotiating with the legislature. Little things, having the right picnic for families, having the families with children bring the kids over, having people fly on Air Force One, little courtesies, phone call on a birthday. There are 1,000 small things that create bipartisanship, even if you disagree about big things. And it's really important to remember that. All the little human things that a good leader can do to get the city of Washington to work again. Tragically, none of them are being done by the current team. Okay.
Thank you so much. Sorry, thank you so much for being on Staten Island, Mr. Gingrich. My name is Letitia Romaro. I'm the former Republican chair of this borough. Mr. Gingrich, I'd like to know what we will do as our next president to bring manufacturing jobs back to America. We need them.
That's a very, very important question. The key to the Reagan model was a four-part plan. Lower taxes, less regulation, more American energy, and actually favor and be friendly and positive about job creators. Obama tends to be wrong on all four. So let me apply it to where we are right now. And let me say, manufacturing jobs are important for two very different reasons. They're important, first of all, because they create real wealth, and they are a powerful way for people to rise. I mean, folks who may not go to college may be able to go and do a technically advanced job, and their kids may or may not go to college, but they earn good livings, they have a real involvement in the community, and so having manufacturing jobs really is important. Second, you cannot be the arsenal of democracy if you don't have an arsenal. We can't compete with China over the next 50 years if all of our manufacturing goes to China. So if we want America to remain an independent country, America has to be a country with a very powerful manufacturing. So let's give you a couple quick examples. On the tax side, I am for 100% expensing. That means all new equipment gets written off in 1 year. So you have a model for the most rapid modernization possible. I'm for zero capital gains tax so that hundreds of billions of dollars I am for abolishing the death tax permanently because it shouldn't punish families who are successful. I am for a 12.5% corporate tax rate, which is the Irish corporate tax rate. It has three great advantages. The first is you'll get about $700 billion home that's currently locked up overseas in profits. The second is that you will be in a position to have General Electric actually pay taxes. Remember, 35%, General Electric hires 375 tax attorneys, the largest private tax firm in the world. At 12.5%, they fire half the attorneys and write a check. So, think of the third, you want our corporations competing in the world market with a relatively low corporate tax rate, not a high corporate tax rate. On deregulation, it's very straightforward. Repeal Obamacare, repeal Sarbanes-Oxley, repeal Dodd-Frank. Replace the Environmental Protection Agency with a brand new Environmental Solutions Agency. Because the Environmental Protection Agency has been a major killer of manufacturing. And finally, develop a new Food and Drug Administration, which is designed to take scientific knowledge from the laboratory and move it to the patient as rapidly as possible. So that will get us a tremendous job. One last thing, which is you need a better trained workforce. I would insist that any unemployment compensation be tied to signing up for a training program so that everybody who's being paid while not doing anything is actually doing something while they're getting paid. One or two last questions. Back there. Go ahead. Go ahead.
We can figure out the question system, because some people say go over there, some people say go over here. So most of the stuff, I don't concentrate.
Okay, let's do this. We'll go one over here and one over there. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, first, I really want to thank you for coming out here to Staten Island. As you might know, 6 presidents have been to Staten Island, but I think the fact that you're the only presidential candidate of either party this cycle that comes to Staten Island shows how much you care about regular people, unlike people inside the Beltway. So I want to really sincerely thank you for that. I have a 3-part question, which is, I think your idea about the debates is a fine one, and I think that would be outstanding. Would you agree to at least some of those debates, including independent or third-party candidates, if only to produce more of an ideas factory for the American electorate to judge from? No. And second, let me just be clear here. Any third-party candidate is an assistance to Obama's re-election. There should be no third-party candidates. You know better than anyone, I'm sure, the president had appointed this deficit reduction committee headed by Bowles and Simpson. I'm wondering, what were your impressions of their specific recommendations, and which, if any of them, would you support?
Don't you put your hand on me. Don't you put your hand on me. I got it in my bag. You mind if I get my bag? I got it in my bag.
Okay, why don't the rest of us allow the drama to work out with the conversation? Again, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry. These things happen.
Did you ride, honey? Did you ride? Good. You're beautiful. Nobody can pick you up.
Go ahead.
That I was one step away from losing my home, being forced on the street, and still liable for a mortgage. Today, fortunately, I'm secure in my home ownership, but my neighborhood is filled with foreclosed properties. People, the banks have forced people out, people have just moved in. For 6 months, I corresponded with Bank of America, trying to get them to be accountable for the house across the street from me, where there's a registered sex offender, drug pushers, and other ne'er-do-wells. There was finally a fire, there was no situation then. My question to you is, what would you do regarding the financial crisis and making banks accountable?
Under Dodd-Frank and under this administration in exactly the wrong direction. We should have adopted a strategy in 2008 that said these banks are too big to fail, which means they're too big to be managed. I mean, the idea of any one of us getting attention at Bank of America is virtually impossible because they're so gigantic that by the time you get to somebody with any level of power, if it's not $1 billion problem, they can't afford to pay attention to it. So I very strongly favor the rise of small local banks and the reestablishment of local community banks. And that's exactly the opposite of where we've gone. This has been a deliberate strategy by the Federal Reserve and the Treasury to have a handful of gigantic banks that they could then manage and manipulate in a centralized way, which is exactly the opposite of how America ought to work. You ought to be able to walk in and see a person face to face who's a real banker with real authority, and you ought to be able to say to them, if we don't get this fixed, you'll be in court next week. It's got to be that kind of real-time
I appreciate your response, and I just want
Hello, Mr. Speaker. In the last debate on national security, you suggested that America was not taking this war seriously. You said, and I'm paraphrasing, that the last time America took a war seriously, it dismantled Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan in 3 years and 8 months. As President of the United States, what would be your very first step towards taking this war, quote unquote, seriously?
Well, that's a great question. You got two different things going on. World War II was total war. And in total war, we frankly cut through all the red tape and just got stuff done. Okay? The Cold War, which lasted basically from 1946 to 1991, lasted 45 years. And we very carefully avoided it becoming a total war because it would have been a nuclear war. So we contained the Soviet Empire by a variety of strategies. And so I think we are much more in a Cold War problem than we are in a World War II problem. But let me give you an example. In 1947, the Soviets were actively and aggressively trying to win the elections in Italy and France. We used our capability to operate covertly, because back then it was real. And we funneled money to every non-communist group, including, frankly, left-wing socialist groups, because we wanted to capture every vote we could away from the communists. Now, if we had had a clear understanding going into Egypt that it was enormously to our advantage for the Muslim Brotherhood to not win, and we had funded every element that was reasonable and moderate and wanted to live in a modern society so that they had the assets to take on the Muslim Brotherhood and to win the election that just occurred, we would be dramatically better off today than we are. We have no ability in the State Department or the intelligence community to understand and wage a long-term covert campaign designed to create a moderate Islam that is prepared to live with us without violence. And the result is we are gradually seeing Islam being pulled by Saudi money and Iranian money in a direction that is very, very bad for the future of the United States. And I think that's the kind of thing where I think you've got to, but I draw a distinction. In terms of, for example, because I used the analogy of World War II to explain building the fence on the border. We are going to draft a bill that says basically we're waiving all federal regulations to get the border built. Period. And we want it done in 1 year. That's a kind of cut through the red tape program. Over here, what you need is a grand strategy with a lot of subtle steps. Listen now, I also did a movie on Pope John Paul II going back to Poland in June of 1979 for 9 days. It's called 9 Days That Changed the World. In that movie, you see, we did it because both Lech Wałęsa in Poland and Václav Havel in the Czech Republic said to us, this was the decisive moment in breaking the Soviet Empire. These 9 days so aroused the people of Eastern Europe, reminded them of religious liberty, reignited their passion, that they never gave up for 10 years and they broke the Soviet Empire. Now, that was not waging a war physically, but it sure was waging an intellectual, moral, psychological war. And it worked. And so I think we need to understand this conflict in the middle of the Middle East is much bigger, much longer term, requires fewer troops and more thinking than we've been putting into it, and requires, frankly, overhauling the State Department and the intelligence community so that they're competent. We're going to sign some books and things, and we've got to also go over and do a forum tonight with Huckabee at Fox, so we have some schedule. Let me just say to all of you, I am thrilled to be here. I think if you go to newt.org, you'll see a tremendous amount of material. We look forward to meeting as many of you as possible later on in a few minutes. And I'm just very, very grateful so many people came out and said, thank you.